Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
So these are the issues that we want to cover today. First, we'll be discussing the inverted economics of cybersecurity and the incentives for cybercrime, and discussing how bad things are. And by the way, they're really bad. Then we want to discuss the inefficiencies of traditional cyber risk assessment and cyber risk management. Why aren't we making more progress? Third, we'll turn to becoming digitally structured, resetting the roles and responsibilities regarding cybersecurity within the organization. And finally, we'll discuss developing empirical, economics-based cyber risk assessment techniques and what you need to be providing your board of directors. So, with those goals in place, let's first turn to discussing the problem. Cybercrime. Let's go to the numbers. According to the best estimates, the costs of criminal activity vary between hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars or euros or more a year. Depends on how you define cybercrime. But basically, it winds up costing us between 1 and 2% of global GDP. One major ISP reports that he is now seeing 80 billion malicious scans every day. There are 300 million new malicious viruses that are created every day. There were 4.8 billion records lost to data breaches in 2016. There are 4,000 ransomware attacks every day. We are currently spending $200,000 per minute on cybersecurity regulations and audits, and those costs are projected to double by next year and go up several hundred times by 2030. How good are the bad guys? The cyber criminals, according to the 2018 Symantec Cybercrime Report, cyber criminals are technologically as sophisticated as the most advanced IT companies, and like them, have moved quickly to adopt artificial intelligence, cloud, software as a service, of course for them it's cybercrime as a service, and encryption. And the McAfee report concludes with this statement: cybercrime is relentless, undiminished, and unlikely to stop. It is just too easy, rewarding, and the chances of getting caught are far too low. Cybercrime also leads on a risk-to-payoff rate. It is a low-risk crime with high profits. A smart cyber criminal can easily make millions without fear of being caught. We successfully prosecute perhaps 1% of cyber criminals. One of the reasons I like talking to primarily European audiences is they tend to be more classically trained than Americans. And so this made me think we should keep in mind the words of the great Roman philosopher and emperor Marcus Aurelius, who said, of each thing we need to demand to know what is it in its essence. What is the essence of the cybersecurity problem? Is it we have selfish companies? I would argue that's not the essence of the problem. There is certainly selfishness out there, and in a moment we'll talk about how the economics of our businesses drive us to be less secure, but I don't think that's the essence of the problem. Is it bad technology? Well, for someone in my generation, I'm a baby boomer, actually the technology is magical. It's marvelous. We now are used to worldwide instantaneous communication, virtually free of charge, including video, almost without regard. If we have to wait 2 seconds for a site to come up on our computers, we get impatient. Actually, the technology is pretty amazing. But we'll talk about why maybe the technology is not adequately secured. Or is it the economy? And this is where we would probably find the essence of the problem. The essence of the cybersecurity problem is that we have an inherently insecure system guarding incredibly valuable data. And by that I mean The system was built to be insecure. The internet was designed to be an open system, not a secure one. You can actually find some of the people who wrote the original protocols are still around. And one of the things they'll tell you is, we were just trying to pass back and forth some research papers. We didn't intend for the world to be run on this internet system we were developing in the 80s and 90s. But that's actually what we've done. So we have this incredibly insecure system designed to be open, and it's guarding virtually all of our personal data, our intellectual property, our national secrets. We have an inherently insecure system guarding incredibly valuable data. And by the way, the insecure system is becoming more and more insecure all the time with the advent of mobile technologies, pads and mobile phones, Internet of Things, cloud computing, etc. We'll discuss this in a moment. But I would argue that is the essence of our cybersecurity problem. And this is consistent with what the research has shown. In their classic book, The Economics of Information Security, Anderson and Moore found that we find that misplaced incentives are as important as technological design. Security failure is caused at least as often by bad incentives as by bad technological design. Well, why don't we have better design? Well, one reason we don't have better design of our products, one reason why our technical products aren't built to be more secure, is because we don't want to pay for the security. That's why they don't teach secure coding in most universities, because people don't want to pay for insecurity. In fact, personally, most of us really can't be bothered with updating our passwords conscientiously or making sure we don't go to websites we shouldn't go to, et cetera, et cetera. Personally, we really don't seem to care that much. Intellectually, we do. Government speeches say we do, but our behavior really doesn't say that. And by the way, although government points fingers, they're just as much to blame. One of my clients told me a story about how they were fulfilling a government contract, and the government entity came to them and said, "These laptops you're selling us, these are insecure." And so the contractor said, "Well, we can secure those for you. It costs you an extra $2 per laptop." And the government entity said, "No, thank you. Cost is driving too much of this." Or maybe it says our technological success has come too fast for us to manage. The World Economic Report for 2018 on cybersecurity said that firms are increasingly competing at different points in the value chain to take advantage of unmet consumer needs, less efficient structures, high capital usage, attractive returns. These changes can bring enormous benefits, including improved customer experience, greater efficiency, and new value creators. We love all those things. However, tech-driven innovations are expanding the amount of cyber risk and enabling more sophisticated attacks. That's the balance that we need to figure out. And historically, this is the case. We have, over the last 20 years, increasingly adopted business practices and technologies that are good for business, good for consumer needs, but undermine our security. This is true with voice over Internet protocol. 2 decades ago, technologists came to the chief executive officers and the chief financial officers in companies and said, "Hey, if we change from our traditional telephone network to a voice over Internet protocol network, we'll dramatically cut costs." And the security people probably came in and said, "Yes, but these VoIP networks are very insecure." And for the most part, the chief financial officer said, "Screw the security, deploy the network, we need to save the money." Same thing is basically true with cloud computing. When cloud computing became popular maybe a decade ago, a study came out that found that 67% of security officers and organizations had little or no faith in the security of data they were putting in the cloud, including 47% who had already put their data in the cloud. Now, why would you do that? Because the cost benefits of cloud computing are so dramatic. Same thing with bring your own device to work. If you want to hire millennials, they're going to bring their device. Same thing with long international supply chains. Very cost efficient, but almost inherently insecure. Now, you can increase the security of these technologies and practices, but it comes at a cost. And that's the problem. We have to find a way to properly balance profitability with security. This is the cyber economic equation that we face. The fact of the matter is, on the offense side, the attackers, attacks are cheap. You can probably get access to a distributed denial of service attack. You can outsource that on the internet for a couple of €100, for maybe €100. You can compromise a corporate mailbox for maybe only €100. You can get false identities to be used on Twitter, Facebook, etc. Very cheap, easy to launch. You can outsource them, as I said before, on the internet. And the profits from these attacks, as we've already discussed, are enormous. And by the way, it's a great business model. You use the same techniques over and over again, same service on a worldwide basis. Great business model. On the defense side, as we've already discussed, the perimeter is unlimited and unprotected. It's hard to show return on investment to things that you prevent. We're usually a generation behind the attacker. We have to see how they're attacking before we respond for the most part. And prosecution is difficult and rare. As I said, we prosecute maybe 1% of cyber criminals. That's the economic equation of cybersecurity. So long as we have this kind of economic equation, it doesn't make that much difference what standards and protocols we follow. The bad guys are going to have a tremendous advantage. And the systems are very difficult to secure. One of the things we do in security, of course, is benchmark. So let's benchmark against the United States military. This is a quote from the Pentagon's annual report. The military's computer networks can be compromised by low to middling skilled attacks. Military systems do not have a sufficiently robust security posture to repel sustained attacks. The development of advanced cyber techniques makes it likely that a determined adversary can acquire a foothold in most DoD systems and be in position to degrade Department of Defense missions when and if they choose. Now, if the most sophisticated and best funded military system in the history of the world can be compromised at any point they choose by middling leveled attacks, how secure can we expect a private business to become? Very difficult situation to deal with. And again, this is very consistent with the theory that we have found. Economists have long known that liability should be assigned to the entity that can manage risk. Yet everywhere we look, we see online risk allocated poorly. People who connect their machines to risky places do not bear the full consequences of their actions, and developers are not compensated for costly efforts to strengthen their code. We all know this in our own real lives. We know that if we have a silly password, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we go to sketchy websites and don't protect ourselves, our credit cards are liable to get hacked, or our credit systems are liable to get hacked. Who pays for that? For the most part, the banks pay for it. The individual consumer doesn't pay for it. We've separated the risk from the payment. Sorry for the... and the market doesn't self-correct. This is the statistics about the process that has gone forth with respect to the stock prices for many of the well-known hacks. Within 6 months after their cyber attack, Target's stock price was up 40%. Sony's stock price was up 30% after their breach. Home Depot, 65 million accounts, 20% increase. JP Morgan stock price after their attack was stable and then went up by 7%. Sears, Kmart, initially down 18%, then up 34%. eBay initially down 6%, up 15%. On average, after initial initial stocks drop, they rebound by about 7% following these incidents. So the market is not self-correcting for these attacks. So ISACA pointed out that the challenge in information security is not that best practices need to be developed, but instead lies in communicating these best practices, demonstrating the value in implementing them, and encouraging individuals and organizations to adopt them. 3 different studies validate the point that I've just made. PricewaterhouseCoopers found that overall cost was most frequently cited as the biggest obstacle to ensuring security of critical networks. McAfee said, making the business case for cybersecurity remains the major challenge because management does not understand either the scale of the threat or the requirements of the solutions. And CSIS found basically the same thing. The number one barrier is that the security folks who haven't been able to communicate the urgency well enough and they haven't been able to persuade the decision makers of the reality of the threat in business terms. So let's move to how we can do that. Let's move first of all to analyzing how have we been doing this, because the way we've been doing it apparently, based on all the research, indicates we haven't been succeeding. Mostly the method for traditional cyber risk management has been checking boxes. We get a list of technical controls and we go through them. The more you check theoretically, the more secure you are. But we don't know which boxes we need to focus on. We don't know how much risk do we get from checking one box over the other. Do we need to check all 500 boxes, or do we only need to check the first 250 or the first 251? Or maybe we should start at 251 and go to 500. We don't know any of these things. And we don't know the difference between some of the color codings that come from the heat maps and various matrices. What's the difference really between yellow and green? We have garbage in and we have garbage out. We need prioritization. We need a cost-based empirical approach. In addition, we don't really know what the advice that we're getting based on this checklist system means. They will come up with a 1 to 5 scale saying that this event is likely or probable or unlikely. But these heat maps don't tell you, they imply some certainty, but they don't tell you how much money you're going to lose. They don't tell you really how probable the scenario is, and they don't tell you what is the adequate cost for adequate risk reduction. These are the things that management, senior management, the board needs to know so that they can do a more effective job at managing cyber risk. And finally, we don't know if any of these systems work at all. In fact, in his classic book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity, Doug Hubbard found that there is not a single study indicating that the use of these methods actually reduces risk. So let's start by thinking about what risk is. Are insiders a risk? Is the supply chain a risk? Is it mobile technology that's a risk? Here's a test that we can use. I hope these come through clearly on the video here. So this is a bald tire. So ask yourself, a bald tire, is that a little bit of a risk? Is that not a risk? Is that a lot of risk? Now, my guess is that most of you think bald tires, that's at least a little bit of a risk, and it's probably a lot of a risk. Unless the bald tire is being used as a tire swing. See, it is the context, not the category, that we need to look to. So if you ask that same question now, is the bald tire a little bit of risk or a lot of a risk? Probably nobody would say it's a lot of risk. And most of us probably would say it's not a risk at all. It's not at all. Unless we look more closely. How much risk is there now? If the bald tire is hanging by a slim thread, then there's a great deal of risk involved. So risk needs to be conceptualized not as a category, but a quantity. We need to be thinking of risk as a measure of future loss from a given scenario, representing how much money the organization might lose from that given scenario over time. Now, this is a much more sophisticated way to understand cyber risk than we have been using historically. But it is something that we can address. And we are moving towards new systems so that we can do this more effectively and more efficiently. So let's talk about this. So a lot of these procedures that I'm about to go through are actually outlined, at least preliminarily, within the Directors Handbook series that have been developed originally by the National Association of Corporate Directors. Currently, we're working on a similar version of this handbook for the European Conference of Corporate Directors. We've already done a version for the Germans that BSI collaborated with, and one for Latin America with the Organization of American States. They all follow basically these same principles. And the first thing we need to tell you before we go through them is that the research indicates that these principles that I'm about to go through actually work. So the PricewaterhouseCoopers Global Information Security found that the guidelines from the NACD advise that boards should view cyber risks from an enterprise-wide standpoint and understand potential legal impacts. They should discuss cybersecurity risk and preparedness with management and consider cyber attacks in the context of the organization's overall tolerance for risk. Boards appear to listen to this advice. This year we saw a double-digit uptick in board participation in most aspects of information security. Deepening board involvement has improved cybersecurity practices in numerous ways. As more boards participate in cybersecurity budget discussions, we saw a 24% boost in security spending. Notable outcomes cited by the survey are that respondents include identification of key risks, fostering a culture of organizational security, better alignment of cybersecurity with overall risk management and business goals, and perhaps more than anything, board participation to open the lines of communication between the cybersecurity function and top executives and directors. So if we can expand our notion of how we do cyber risk analysis and consider it more from the top down rather than the bottom up, we can be more successful. Among the organizations that have endorsed this program are the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Department of Justice, Government Cybersecurity Divisions in Germany, BSI, the Organization of American States, the National Association of Corporate Directors, the European Confederation of Directors Associations, the Japan Business Federation, and the International Auditing Association. So there's a great deal of support for the approach that we're about to discuss. These are the issues. These are the principles that are in these handbooks. First, we need to understand that cyber is not an IT issue. It is an enterprise-wide risk management issue. It needs to be considered in a much broader context, in a much more sophisticated way. Second, boards need to understand their unique legal obligations, and boards need to assess adequate cybersecurity expertise. Now, we're not going to talk about those three principles on this call as we move forward, because most we have managing people on the line today, not board people. But the final two objectives in the NACD Cyber Risk Handbooks are these. Management needs to provide to the board a security framework, both a technical security framework and a structural security framework. We're going to talk a little bit about the structural frameworks more than the technical ones in front of me. And third, and finally, management must provide a cyber risk assessment, but it needs to be a sophisticated risk assessment, one that includes not just the technologies, but the economics of the issue. And we'll discuss how we can do that. So first, turning to Principle 4, management needs to provide the board with a framework for enterprise risk. Now, by this, we mean that management needs to be structured for an enterprise-wide cyber risk assessment, not just IT. And then we'll turn to Principle 5, which is that management must provide the board with analysis of risks and tell them what to avoid, what to accept, what to mitigate, what to transfer, for example, through insurance. And finally, management needs to present the board with an economics-based cyber risk assessment, tying cyber risk to the business. So, Principle 4. Having a cybersecure framework. Now, obviously, most on the call are familiar with the technical frameworks. You can use the NIST framework. You can use the ISO framework. There's the PCIS framework. There are a whole bunch of frameworks out there. Most larger organizations, in my experience, actually develop their own framework. They take parts of ISO and parts of NIST and add a couple, maybe from a regulator, if they're in that kind of sector of the industry. And these are great technical frameworks, and there are a number of specific provisions within these frameworks that have been demonstrated to be cost-effective, restricting user installation, making sure the operational systems are patched, ensuring that the software applications have updates, restricting administrative privileges. All of these things have been shown to be effective and really need to be part of this establishment of a framework for technical cybersecurity. I think we all probably on this call are aware of all these things, and it's not necessary to go through this in more detail. What we want to talk about, however, is the structural framework. In order to do a sophisticated risk assessment, a risk assessment of the sort that we're describing here, one that is empirically based, that goes beyond checking boxes, that deals with the business, there are a range of skills that go beyond simply the technical operational understanding. Of course, the technical operations, as we've already said, are critical. They're the foundation for doing a good cyber risk assessment. But in order to do a truly effective cyber risk assessment, you need added skills. And among those that we have found are you need critical thinking skills. You need an understanding of probability. We need to have people who have been trained in calibrated estimation. There needs to be a comfort with numbers. There needs to be a familiarity with decision-making models. And most importantly, from the board's perspective, if we're going to create this broader enterprise-wide system of cyber risk management that's going to look at things from the business point of view, you need familiarity with the business. Most IT departments, most CISO departments are not going to have all of these things. We need a proper cyber risk management system that uses systematic, ideally empirical, enterprise-wide risk assessment and management frameworks. These need to be developed. One place where we have worked to articulate some of these is in this publication that the Internet Security Alliance and the American National Standards Institute put out a couple of years ago. In this, we defined a management framework for cyber risk management, and this begins with developing using not just the technical department, the information security department to run cybersecurity, but instead to have an enterprise-wide cyber risk management team that meets regularly and has its own budget. It would include not just technical and operations, but it would include the chief financial officer's office, the human resource office, the legal and compliance office, operation and technology, of course, but also communications, risk management, development of insurance strategies. All of these people need to be meeting together on a comparatively regular basis. We advocate quarterly to define an enterprise-wide cyber risk management program. And frankly, it ought to be run by not IT. There's an old saying here in the States, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you have your IT department running your cybersecurity operation, you're going to get almost all IT solutions. And the IT is important. But we also know that most information technology systems are undermined not by the technology, but by the human beings. Human resources is just as important as IT in doing adequate cyber risk assessment. And those of us in this heightened era where government agencies are looking more carefully at us, we need the legal and compliance people involved in there. We also need them involved because many of the vulnerabilities are actually ones that we bring in from the outside, vendors and users, etc. A lot of the security mechanisms we need for our own corporations need to be embedded in contracts. And we need the legal people involved in that. And we need the communications people, the public relations people. If you're part of an organization that has a breach, one of the things that your board is going to be extremely interested in is reputational management. Reputational risk is a major issue for them. For that, you need to go beyond the IT department. You need the public relations department in. So we need an enterprise-wide cyber risk management thing, including the risk management people who often deal with insurance, because some of this risk we may want to transfer. So this is an entirely different way to construct cybersecurity from a roles and responsibilities point of view. Some of these roles and responsibilities have been defined even more specifically within particular sectors. So one of the more sophisticated implementations of this enterprise-wide approach is called the 3LD program. And this establishes 3 different lines of defense within an organization for cybersecurity risk management. Line 1 operates the business. They owns the risk designs. They implement the operations. Line 2 defines the policy statements, the risk management framework, provides a credible challenge to the first line. Are you sure you're doing this right? Is this in line with the business? Is this adequate? They're responsible for evaluating risk exposure for the board to determine what is the appropriate risk appetite. And line 3 is commonly internal audit, and they're responsible for independent evaluation of the first and second lines. To go into this in a bit more detail, let's talk about that first line of defense. So they provide a thorough exam. Is the business doing enough? It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Checking all the boxes won't work. Each business line defines cyber risk as they face it, and they weave cyber risk and self-assessment into fraud, crisis management, and the resiliency process. Cybersecurity needs to be woven into the business on the front end, not just considered as an appendage on the back end. This is what that first line of defense attempts to do. Define the business strategy, include cybersecurity within the business lines, and the business lines need to actively monitor the existing and the future exposures, the vulnerabilities, the threats, and assess what impact the cyber risk has on each new technology deployment, or each new client relationship, or the business strategies. That's the responsibility for your first line of defense. And obviously this goes on far beyond just IT, although IT needs to be involved. Then there's the second line of defense. This line of defense should be walled off as a separate, independent function than the people running that first line of defense. These people manage the enterprise cyber risk appetite and the risk management framework within the overall enterprise risk. And they challenge the first line. They determine how appropriately to measure cyber risk and how to integrate risk tolerance in a statement for the overall organization. They focus on the first and second tiers and need to be effectively managing risk, not regulatory compliance, although it can include regulatory compliance, but focusing on risk, not necessarily compliance. And we'll talk in a moment about how we are going to define risk a little bit more clearly within the context of the analysis. And then you move to the third line of defense. That third line of defense, typically internal audit, provides independent, objective assessment of the firm's process across the lines of 1 and 2, and focus on the operational effectiveness and efficiency. Traditionally, as I said, this is international audit, and they can rely on frameworks like NIST or ISO or whatever, but the firms will need to develop their own to adopt to enhance threats. So part of this new risk management approach is to be forward-looking, to look at what are the threats that are going to come in, what's most likely to happen to me, and how do we need to respond. Internal audit performs assessments, validates the technology structure and third-party risks. They do independent pen testing, and they must stay abreast of the threat intel. So that process, that three-line of defense system, is a more sophisticated version of what we outlined in the original publication with ANSI. So at the minimum, we would advocate organizations need to be elevating cybersecurity out of their IT departments, making it an enterprise-wide committee involving everybody in the process with a separate budget, not run by the IT department. And if you want to get more sophisticated about it, there are these other more sophisticated models, such as the three lines that I've just gone through. That said, let's turn to the fifth and final principle in the NACD handbook. And this is doing modern cyber risk management. And when we talk about modern cyber risk management, we're talking about focusing not on the attacks, but the impacts of the attacks. We need to clarify the terms. We need better scoping. We need to do away with the bogus math that comes with some of these traditional functions where we lump everything into ordinal scales of 1 through 5 and don't really know what they mean. We need to place cyber events in a quantitative and economic terms and prioritize it within the business. By doing this, we need to know, we can figure out, do we need to keep spending on this particular technique, or can we not spend on that technique and spend on other techniques? One of the things that, by the way, we have found over the past several years is that starting about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a real boom in cyber spending. Cyber risk budgets were going up 15, 20, 25% in some instances. We're now seeing some exhaustion with regard to that. Boards are now saying we're not going to increase your budget 25% every single year. We need to know what not to spend on as well as we know what to spend on. A sophisticated cyber risk assessment will be able to do this. Are the risks really the risks, or are they just the innovations? So we need a new direction for both government and industry. Now, the good news here is that there are several of these models now available in the market. Now, quick note here, I work for the Internet Security Alliance. The Internet Security Alliance doesn't endorse any specific products. In fact, we don't sell any products, we don't sell any services, we just do things such as we're doing today. But there are a variety of places that you can go in the community to find these things. I already mentioned Doug Hubbard's book. which came out in 2016 that really started this sort of revolution. It's called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity. There is an open source system of what we're about to discuss called Factor Analytics for Information Risk, or FAIR. You can go to the FAIR Institute. Again, this is an open source model. And then there are proprietary models. One of them is X Analytics. So there are a variety of consultancies that you can go to get access to any of these sorts of things. Again, which you may want to use is something that needs to be decided by your own organization. We don't endorse any of them. The important thing to know is that these mechanisms and these tools are now out there in the community, and you can access them. So this is the basic cyber risk assessment and economics methodology that all of these various models are going to follow. What they will ask you to do is first, using the best available data, make a probabilistic assessment of possible cyber risks scenarios. You're looking here for accuracy, not precision. Now, for a long time, it has been said, well, we don't have any data in cybersecurity. That's not true anymore. There's lots of places you can go to get data. Most of your organizations probably have your own data. If not, there are trade associations that have data. There are government agencies that have data. Get the best available data so that you can make a probable risk assessment of possible scenarios. A key element of this approach is that it needs to be forward-looking, not backward-looking. One of the differences between doing good cyber auditing as opposed to good financial service auditing is if you're auditing for finance, that is a backward-looking, check-the-box process. Were you adequately disclosing? Did you fill out all your forms, et cetera, et cetera? It's backward-looking. Cyber risk management needs to be forward-looking. You need to be analyzing the attack community out there. Who is liable to attack you? How are they liable to get you? And you get the best possible data, and then you make a probabilistic assessment of what is likely to happen to you. Then you focus on the scenarios that are probable and have enough expected loss for you to matter. When you calculate the best case, worst case, most likely case, and what degree of loss is going to be acceptable to the organization in financial terms. This is your risk appetite. Then you determine what investment is required to mitigate those scenarios. And finally, as an option, there are tools out there so that you can run multiple scenarios, even thousands of scenarios, called Monte Carlo simulations. So you get the best available data. You analyze what do we think is most likely to happen to us. How much would this attack cost us if it was this degree of success? What's the best case? What's the worst case? What can we tolerate? How much risk can we tolerate? And if we come up with that number, then we have a good idea of how much we need to invest to bring it down to an acceptable level. And if we like, we can use Monte Carlo simulations or other techniques so that we can put this in a true economics-based manner. The last issue I want to touch on before we leave is government-industry collaboration. This is not the main point of this webinar this morning, but from the Internet Security Alliance point of view, we need to involve government in this operation. Because one of the unique things about the digital age is that in this scenario, that is cybercrime, we're all on the same side. The criminals are out there stealing personal data, corporate intellectual property, and government secrets. This isn't like Enron or Volkswagen or some case of corporate misfeasance or malfeasance. This is an economics-based business proposition from the criminal point of view. They're making tons of money stealing all of our stuff. We need to be working more together. The blame the victim strategy, that if you have been successfully breached, you must have done something wrong. That's the wrong approach. Calls for accountability go both ways. Certainly we need to be more accountable on the corporate side, but we also need accountability on the government side. Why are we only prosecuting 1% of cyber criminals? We need to reach out to business and industry and need to develop a collaborative model here. This is a different sort of thing. And while we do this, we will realize that government industry legitimately assess cyber risk differently. For the private sector, this is largely an economic issue. So every corporation knows that 10% of their inventory is walking out the back door. Why don't they hire more guards and put up more cameras? Because it will cost them 11%. It's pretty much an economic issue for the government. They have economics, but they also have national security to consider. They have individual privacy for their constituents to consider. So there are other issues. So there's going to be a delta between what is commercial level security and national security. But in the cyber world, we're all using the same system. And the cyber attacks that may come from a nation state, and we are already seeing these, they aren't necessarily going to be military to military. They're going to be military often to the private sector. We need to find a way to get the private sector and the public sector to work more collaboratively together. And the traditional models and assumptions simply aren't working, as we've demonstrated earlier. So what we need here is a new social contract between industry and government to work more collaboratively together on cybersecurity. This will call for us to rethink our government and industry roles and responsibilities, create market incentives to rebalance the economic incentives of cybersecurity, and this will take a lot of work. We actually happen to think that this is possible. We can do this. We have done this in the past. I think the Europeans make a tremendous example of this. I mean, the European continent for millennia has been a battleground. You've measured your wars in hundreds of years. You had 100 years of war, 300 years of war. Last century, we had 2 world wars, largely fought on the European continent. But for the last 75 years, we've had almost complete peace on the European continent. How did we do that? How did you do that? You did that by rethinking old alliances and old enemies. You did it by rethinking your structures. You did it by reorganizing your economic model. For 75 years, there has been peace on the European continent. We need to do a similar task with respect to cybersecurity. We need to rethink the relationship between industry and government. We need to stop thinking of government simply as a parent to industry, and we need to be thinking of ourselves more as mutual partners. And we need to create some economic incentives so that we can elevate security beyond the commercial level to potentially the national security level. Fortunately, there are all sorts of economic incentives that we've used in other areas of the economy: agriculture, aviation, ground transport, environment. We have found ways to develop economic incentives for businesses to sustainably invest in pro-social things. We have not done that in cybersecurity. So in conclusion, we have an enormous cybersecurity problem, largely foisted on both government and industry by criminal entities, including nation states, who are exploiting the inherently secure networks that we are operating on, and we are not making enough progress to fight them. However, if we rethink our model at the enterprise level, we rethink our roles and responsibilities, we elevate our vision beyond just the technical operations function, but to the overall management function, the overall economic function of the enterprise, and we utilize some of the more sophisticated empirical economic tools that have now come out on the market in the last few years, we think we can make substantially more progress towards cyber resiliency. We're not going to solve this problem, but we can manage it far better. And when we do that, we need to develop greater industry-government partnerships because, as I say, we're all on the same side. With that, let me conclude my initial portion of the conversation and turn it back to Adrian and see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you, Larry, for delivering this very, very informative and insightful session. I believe that the audience had the chance to learn new sophisticated cyber risk management techniques in this session that are also applicable and effective in their organizations. I also want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 27032 cybersecurity. A PCB certificate in this course will show your dedication in implementing and managing cybersecurity process and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now we'll go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees regarding today's session. The first question is, what lessons can we get from some of the recent data breaches, such as Marriott, Equifax, British Airways, and so forth? What steps do we need to follow in order to avoid such catastrophic data breaches?
Well, I think it's first of all important to understand that we are not going to be able to completely prevent data breaches. As I said, the system itself is vulnerable. It is vulnerable at its core, and we are making it more vulnerable with the deployment of increasingly advanced technology. Much of that new technology brings new vulnerabilities to the system. That, combined with all of the economic incentives I discussed before, indicate that we are going to continue to have attacks, and we are probably going to continue to have breaches. So we are not going to be able to stop this, but there are many social ills we're not able to stop. We have not stopped people from murdering each other going back to Cain and Abel. But we can do a much better job in managing this issue. We would suggest that there are a number of things that you can do. First of all, we would suggest that organizations look within themselves and become much more sophisticated with respect to understanding their cyber risk and understanding how to attack cyber risk. And those are some of the things I went through during my presentation. Board involvement needs to be increased. Enterprise-wide involvement needs to be increased, and collaboration with our government partners needs to be increased. Speaking just within the enterprise itself, leaving the government aside for the moment, what we have found, and what the PricewaterhouseCoopers study indicates, is that if you adopt this enterprise-wide risk management model, and if you adopt some of these more sophisticated techniques, which frankly are going to cost more money to implement and are more difficult than just checking boxes. But if you do this, you are going to wind up with better cyber security budgeting, better risk management, you'll help create a culture of security within the organization. And when you do that, the organization's overall resiliency will be increased. So there are a variety of things that you can do, including reaching out to your partners, making sure that when you have a strategic relationship, that cybersecurity is involved in that strategic relationship. So at a board level, when boards consider a merger or an acquisition, they need to be considering cybersecurity. They need to be bringing their technical departments into those M&A discussions at the front end, not at the back end, at the front end. And the contracting people need to be involved so that they are putting into the contracts adequate assurances that the new agency that you'll be interacting with will also have the security standards and procedures that you found adequate for your organization, because they are now actually part of your organization due to the interconnection. So there's a range of things that can be done, but I would strongly advise looking into those advanced models, the X Analytics and the FAIR and the Hubbard models that I discussed. I think that from an operational point of view, that's where a leading organization should go.
Thank you, Larry. Another question is, what other options can governments have to either enforce or ensure that organizations, both public and private, do their due diligence and due care to secure systems and organizations if penalties are not an option?
Well, certainly if an organization engages in criminal behavior, and corporate misfeasance or malfeasance is criminal behavior, the government should be enforcing things on them. But the government really does not have the vision in order to determine what is adequate cyber risk management for all industries. From my point of view, that's an unfortunately simplified view of the cyber risk situation we have. The reality is that the cyber attackers will access the system and do reconnaissance on it, and they will determine how to get into your system. And as was pointed out in the quotation we had from the Pentagon, a sustained attack is going to succeed. So rather than define a set of technical standards, a checklist, and then penalizing an organization who has been breached, that's blaming the victim. What we would suggest instead is that government do two things, both of which are harder than just blaming the victims. The first thing is that the governments need to be looking at how we can provide adequate incentives for organizations to move beyond the traditional commercial level security up to a national level security. We know many of these attacks, the NotPetya attacks, the ransomware attacks that ran through Europe a year or so ago, the attack on the Bank of Bangladesh, these were done by the North Korean government. The North Korean government are bank robbers. The Chinese government, I believe, have been stealing our intellectual property, European and U.S., for a decade. That is the only way that you get growth rates of 10 and 12% year over year. Nobody innovates that fast. That's done by theft. So no private entity is going to be able to withstand attacks from a nation state. Government needs to be working with its private sector so that we collectively elevate these things. And we have done this in other areas of the economy. As I say, if you look to agriculture or aviation or ground transport or environment, we have incentive models that can be put in. And I'm not even talking about tax breaks here. There are all sorts of incentive models, and the government needs to be providing those in a collaborative rather than a punitive fashion. The other thing that government really has been falling down terribly on is law enforcement. Instead of blaming the corporations, why don't we start blaming the criminals who are out there breaking into these systems? Leave aside the nation states. As I pointed out, sophisticated criminal entities are using AI and cloud and software as a service to attack private sector entities, and we are prosecuting 1% of these, and it's $1 trillion crime. Why do we not have the legal arrangements in the digital world that we have in the physical world? We don't have these. We don't have the treaties. We don't have the collaborative agreements that we have for traditional crime in the cyber world. That's why we're not prosecuting any of these people. So if we want to deter cyber attacks, a good way to deter them is let's start throwing some of these people in jail. And this is going to entail governments funding their digital law enforcement processes far better. So, if I were advising government, I would say your responsibility is law enforcement. Focus there and stop, blaming the victims. Now, if a corporation does something that breaks the law, absolutely do that. But having been victim of a breach is not breaking the law. And you can always find some way to get in. The research shows this very, very clearly. That's blaming the victim. We need to work together, not be pointing fingers at each other.
Great, thank you. We're getting actually a lot of questions for this very interactive session, but because of the time limitation, we can only answer one more question. The last question is, considering the skepticism of the most executives that still believe that cybersecurity is a matter of costs instead of investment, what could be a better approach in a way to change their minds?
Well, what we have found is that most traditionally, historically, most management and boards really don't understand what we're talking about in cybersecurity, and that's mostly because we've been talking largely to them in technical jargon that they don't understand. And so they're not being responsive. And this is what I cited 3 different studies from CSIS, from McAfee, from the World Economic Forum that all said the problem is we have not been communicating adequately to management. And I think one of the problems here is that we have been insisting that they learn our language, and what we need to do is we need to speak in their language. Their language is one of economics. If we use some of these sophisticated models, we can take cyber risk and put it in economic business terms so that they can understand it better. And if we can put it in terms that they understand, we will get better success. And that is what the PricewaterhouseCoopers study found when they analyzed the process that is outlined in these Cyber Risk Handbooks, which I went through in the presentation, that we actually can get vastly increased budgets. I think PricewaterhouseCoopers said it was a 27% increase. That's a substantial amount of money. But you have to talk their language, not insist that they learn your language.
Thank you, Larry, once again for this very informative session, and thank you everyone for attending today's very interactive webinar. Please be informed that besides sending the recorded session and the PowerPoint slides in your email, this session will be also recorded and posted on our website as well as on our YouTube channel, along with the slides of the presentation. For more information about our webinars or our upcoming PECB Insights Conference, please visit our website, www.becb.com. Thank you all and have a great day.